Gilles de Rais. We will explore the contradictory and gruesome story of Gilles de Rais, a famous hero in the fierce war between France and England, but also the most brutal murderer in European history. From the halo of resounding victories to the darkness of horrifying crimes, his bloody legacy still haunts human history to this day. Born in 1405 in Brittany, Gilles de Rais grew up in a noble and powerful family. He received a privileged education and was a brave warrior in the Hundred Years' War, especially contributing to the victory with Joan of Arc. As one of Joan of Arc's most loyal allies, Gilles de Rais was considered a symbol of courage and loyalty. But soon after the war ended, his career path began to take a cruel turn. After his rise to fame, Gilles de Rais lived a lavish life, spending his money lavishly. However, that was only on the surface. Inside his castle, horrific crimes began to take place. Gilles was accused of murdering hundreds of children over the years. The victims were cast aside in evil rituals, and their bodies were mutilated in gruesome rites. In 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested after his crimes were exposed. During his trial, he confessed to his atrocities, but that did little to ease the public's horror. Gilles de Rais was sentenced to death and burned alive. His punishment was a bitter reminder of the consequences of greed and corruption. To this day, Gilles de Rais remains one of the most controversial figures in history. Some believe he was wronged and a victim of political intrigue, while others believe he was truly a monster in human form. Gilles de Rais left a dark mark on history, but also raises questions about the line between hero and monster. Is it a matter of nature or a matter of circumstance? H. Holmes. The Murderer in the Death Castle. In 1893, when the whole world was excitedly flocking to the World Exhibition in Chicago to admire the technological and cultural wonders, a creepy darkness was silently covering the city. Amidst the luxury of the bustling metropolis, hidden in the majestic castle called the Death Hotel, the notorious murderer, H. Holmes, carried out horrifying plots. Behind the magnificent appearance is a deadly maze with secret rooms, trapdoors, and deadly traps. Born in 1861 in New Hampshire, with the birth name Herman Webster Mudgett, Holmes showed intelligence and psychological manipulation skills from a young age. However, inside there was a dangerous nature. After abandoning his family, he moved to Chicago to begin the most heinous scheme of his life. Holmes built a huge castle, falsely claiming to be a hotel. But behind its walls and corridors, he hid torture chambers, secret tunnels, and trapdoors. Each was designed to serve the purpose of committing a heinous crime. Holmes lured his victims with the promise of cheap work or lodging, but once they entered the castle, they never left. In 1894, Holmes was arrested after his business partners accused him of fraud. When police investigated the hotel, they discovered scores of bodies and evidence of horrific crimes. During his trial, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, but the actual number may have been in the hundreds. Holmes was sentenced to death and hanged in 1896. H. Holmes has become a symbol of brutality and dark intelligence. His terrifying story not only haunts everywhere but also inspires countless works of art and popular culture. Although Holmes's Death Castle has been destroyed, the shadow of his crimes still haunts American criminal history, as a chilling reminder of the cruel nature hidden deep within humans. Albert Fish, the monster in the form of a gentle grandfather. From he is a gentle grandfather, a father. But behind that appearance are terrifying effects. Albert Fish, the monster who spread fear in the 1920s. Let's explore the terrifying story of this monster. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C. Fish's mother died when he was 5 years old, and Fish was thrown into the orphanage system. There, Fish witnessed brutal punishments that left a lasting impression on his mind. As he grew older, Fish began to develop deviant behavior, with a tendency to rot in the dark. In the 1920s, Albert Fish began a series of horrific crimes. He targeted children, tricking them with promises of food or gifts, then brutally murdering them. One of Fish's most famous crimes was the murder of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl. After the murder, Fish also sent letters to the victim's family, describing in detail his brutal actions, shocking the whole of America. In 1934, thanks to Fish's letter to the Budd family, the police tracked him down and arrested him. During the interrogation, Fish admitted to killing at least 3 people, but the actual number could be much higher. At trial, Fish admitted to his gruesome acts without showing any remorse. Psychologists call him one of the most pathological killers in history. In 1936, Albert Fish was sentenced to death by electric chair. But even when facing death, he remained cool. He even declared that this would be the most thrilling moment of his life. The story of Albert Fish is not only a dark page in the history of American crime, but also a reminder of the potential danger lurking behind seemingly harmless faces. Can we recognize a monster before it's too late? Jack the Ripper, The Ghost in the Dark, of London, 1888. In the poor district of Whitechapel, a ghost has spread terror. The cold-blooded killer known as Jack the Ripper has committed gruesome crimes, leaving the whole city in fear. Discover the mystery of this murderer. In the late 19th century, the Whitechapel area of London was a gathering place for the poor, workers, and prostitutes. In the darkness of life, the murderer took advantage of it to commit the most barbaric crimes. Jack the Ripper began his series of crimes on August 31st, 1888 with his first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. A series of subsequent victims such as Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were brutally murdered, with horrifying marks on their bodies. The killer also challenged the police with letters signed Jack the Ripper, describing the crime in detail and causing public panic. London police served the investigation with the most scientific methods at that time. However, Jack the Ripper always acrobatic and avoided solid evidence. Dozens of suspects were listed, from aristocrats to doctors and ordinary workers. But the true identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery. The story of Jack the Ripper is not only a dark page in the history of crime, but also an inspiration for popular culture. From Hollywood movies to detective novels, the image of Jack the Ripper still lives on as a symbol of mystery and horror. More than 130 years have passed, but the mystery of Jack the Ripper has not been solved. Will his ghost forever haunt human memory, or will the truth one day be revealed? Andrei Chikatilo, the Ripper, the Soviet Union's most brutal murderer. Dozens of brutally dissected bodies, victims disappeared without a trace in the gloomy forests. Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Cannibal Butcher, spread terror throughout the Soviet Union during the 1980s. Who was he to commit such brutal crimes? Let's explore the portrait of this cold-blooded monster. Born in 1936 in Ukraine, amid a terrible famine, Andrei Chikatilo grew up in misery. His troubled childhood was marked by poverty, domestic violence, and mental illness. Despite his efforts to rise up, Chikatilo repeatedly failed in his work and marriage. His inner repression gradually turned him into a monster. From 1978 to 1990, Chikatilo began a series of gruesome crimes, killing more than 50 victims, mostly children and women. He preyed on the weakest people to satisfy his sick acts. The wounds on the victims' bodies showed the ruthlessness of the murderer. Chikatilo turned his crimes into a way to carry out the most perverse desires. After many years of evasion, Chikatilo was arrested in 1990 after a lengthy and laborious investigation. DNA evidence and his confession convicted this monster. In 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was sentenced to death for his horrifying crimes. On February 14, 1994, he was executed by hanging. Andrei Chikatilo became one of the most dangerous murderers in the history of crime. His crimes not only haunted the Soviet Union, but also left a warning about the power of sick psychology if left unchecked. David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer. In an ordinary trailer in New Mexico, David Parker Ray turned it into a toy box, a horrifying torture chamber. He caused fear with his barbaric crimes against dozens of victims. Who is this noble evil, and how did he exploit the toy box? David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939 in New Mexico. Underneath his normal appearance, Ray was an engineer, father, and beloved neighbor. However, behind that normal appearance was a sick mind, with evils that made the world shudder. Ray spent thousands of dollars to convert a trailer into a toy box, a horrifying torture chamber with homemade devices. Every little corner of this terrifying room was designed to carry out the most sickening acts. He even recorded voice tapes detailing his torture and sent them to his victims while they were being kidnapped. These notes and audios shocked the public. In 1999, Ray was arrested after one of his victims escaped and reported him. When police searched the toy box, what they found was shocking: torture instruments, tapes, and a list of dozens of victims. Eventually, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but he died of a heart attack in 2002 before serving his sentence. Ray's gruesome crimes have left lasting scars on the surviving victims. BTK Killer, the haunting murderer in American crime. History. For more than 3 decades, a ghost named BTK has haunted and spread terror throughout Wichita, Kansas. Bind, torture, kill is not only the method of committing crimes, but also the cruel declaration of this cold-blooded killer. Who is he that can be so heartless to commit such horrifying crimes? Let's uncover the mystery of the monster named BTK. Dennis Rader, born on March 9, 1945, was an ordinary citizen, a father, a husband, and even a leader in the church. However, behind that veiled appearance was a dangerous monster. From his early years, Rader showed signs of psychological instability and manipulative behavior. However, no one expected that he would become one of the most notorious murderers. BTK began his gruesome crimes in 1974 with the Otero family. Each victim was tied up, tortured, and executed in the most brutal ways. BTK sent letters to the police and the press, clearly stating the details of the crimes and satirizing the system's incompetence. These letters were both clues and a way for the killer to demonstrate his manipulation. After more than 30 years of spreading fear, BTK was arrested in 2005 thanks to DNA evidence and the mistake of sending the last letter. When faced with justice, Dennis Rader admitted that he was BTK. Rader was sentenced to 10 life sentences without the possibility of parole. His crimes were not only shocking, but also a warning to the legal system. BTK's story is one of the most mysterious and haunting pages in the history of crime. This killer reminds us that danger sometimes comes from the most seemingly safe corners. Harold Shipman, the most notorious doctor of death in British history. For many years, Harold Shipman was known as a dedicated, caring, and trustworthy doctor. But behind that gentle face, hundreds of patients became victims of one of the most ruthless murderers in history. Who was Harold Shipman, and how was he able to penetrate the health system for so many years? Born in 1946 in Nottingham, England, Harold Shipman grew up in a working-class family. The tragic story of his life began when his mother died of cancer, and her treatment with morphine left a profound impact on the mind of young Harold. Harold graduated from medical school in 1970 and quickly became known as a dedicated doctor. However, early in his career, he was arrested for abusing drugs while dispensing medicine to patients. Harold Shipman used his position as a doctor to execute his elderly victims, mostly women. He often used morphine to cause death, then falsified death certificates to cover up his crimes. He meticulously planned and maintained a series of crimes over many years, causing the deaths of more than 200 patients. In 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested after a victim's family became suspicious and requested an investigation. As police excavated the papers and bodies, the evidence began to emerge. In 2000, Harold Shipman was sentenced to death for 15 murders, but the actual number of victims is believed to exceed 200. The story of Harold Shipman not only caused horror and outrage, but also raised serious questions about the loopholes in the health system. He carved the image of a white-coated death, becoming the most terrifying and haunting symbol in the history of human crime. In 2004, Harold Shipman committed suicide in prison, ending his series of crimes. But his legacy remains a reminder that cruelty sometimes lurks in the most seemingly safe of people. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the Beast of the Andes, Killer. Imagine walking through the mists of the Andes, one of the world's largest mountain ranges. But instead of majestic beauty, terrifying darkness awaits you. Pedro Alonso Lopez, the Beast of the Andes, struck fear into hundreds of families. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born in 1948 in Colombia, to a poor family. After his father died in the Civil War, Pedro grew up in a violent and abusive environment. Pedro's troubled childhood led him to become a sadist. At the age of 18, he began a series of violent and cruel acts. Pedro Alonso Lopez targeted poor children in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. He murdered more than 300 prostitutes over the years, committing one of the most gruesome crimes in history. Lopez was a master of manipulation, luring victims with promises of food or coins, then leading them into a deadly trap. In 1980, Pedro Alonso Lopez was arrested when a victim escaped and alerted the police. During interrogation, he admitted to killing hundreds of victims, shocking the world. Lopez was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum penalty in Ecuador at the time. But his release in 1994 caused a public outcry. Pedro Alonso Lopez, a savage murderer, left a haunting legacy. Hundreds of families are forever burdened with grief, while the question of his crimes still leaves a fearful mark on the history of crime. David Berkowitz, son of Sam, the man who sowed terror in the heart of New York, 1976. In the darkness of a turbulent time, a name has sown terror. Son of Sam, David Berkowitz, with a gun in hand and a challenging letter, has turned the city's streets into a hunting ground. Born on June 1, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, David Berkowitz had a troubled childhood. Adopted as a child, David always felt abandoned and isolated. Those unstable emotions became the trigger for dark actions later on. After serving in the army, Berkowitz returned to New York. Instead of seeking a normal life, he was immersed in distorted thoughts of violence and revenge. From July 1976 to July 1977, David Berkowitz carried out a series of bloody attacks, killing 6 people and injuring 7 others. He targeted couples in cars, turning romantic moments into nightmares. Berkowitz's attacks not only caused panic among the public, but also put the New York police in a difficult position. He left challenging letters signed Son of Sam, which made the public even more afraid. In August 1977, thanks to a traffic ticket, the police tracked down David Berkowitz's whereabouts. When he was arrested, he calmly admitted to all his crimes, shocking the whole of America. During the trial, Berkowitz claimed that he was controlled by the voice of a monster through his neighbor's dog. These statements have led many to question his mental health. However, the court still found him responsible and sentenced him to life in prison. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, became a symbol of brutality and fear in New York in the 1970s. Even after being imprisoned, his story remains a haunting legacy in the history of crime. Today, David Berkowitz claims to have reformed and become a religious believer. But can his horrific past be easily erased? He remains a permanent reminder of a dark period in New York's criminal history. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. Milwaukee, 1980s. In the shadows of an ordinary apartment building, Jeffrey Dahmer, aka the Milwaukee Monster, terrorized the world with his unimaginable crimes. Discover one of history's most ruthless serial killers. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in a troubled family. From an early age, Jeffrey showed signs of mania, with an obsession with violence and the manipulation of dead animals. At one point, Dahmer began drinking at school, playing pranks on his classmates, and showing an attraction to bizarre acts such as animal dissection. It all started with a small hint of a darkness brewing. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer murdered 17 victims, mostly young men and minorities. His crimes included murder, cannibalism, and disfigurement. The evidence recovered from Dahmer's apartment was shocking: bodies embalmed in acid, carefully preserved body parts, and photographs of his horrific acts. In 1991, after a victim escaped and reported the killing to the police, Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. During interrogation, he calmly confessed to everything, describing his sick crimes in detail. During his trial, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life sentences. However, his calm and lack of remorse only angered the public. In 1994, Dahmer died after being murdered by a fellow inmate in prison. His death not only ended a life of crime, but also closed a haunting chapter in the history of American crime. Richard Ramirez, the Dark Predator. Imagine a troubled Los Angeles, where every window is locked in fear. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Dark Predator, terrorized the city with his brutal crimes at night. Born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Richard Ramirez grew up in a poor family. His troubled childhood and domestic abuse laid the foundation for his later violent behavior. The negative influence of his cousin, a former soldier in the Vietnam War, contributed to Ramirez's slide into crime. From June 1984 to August 1985, Richard Ramirez committed a series of crimes including 13 murders, a series of kidnappings, and sexual assaults. He preyed on unsuspecting families, breaking into them in the dead of night and turning each home into a scene of horror. Ramirez was a self-proclaimed Satanist, often leaving related symbols at the scene of his crimes. This caused further public panic. In August 1985, thanks to the cooperation of the public, Richard Ramirez was arrested. His statement, "Hail Satan," in court confirmed his dangerous and brutal nature. Ramirez was sentenced to death for 13 murders, 5 sexual assaults, and 11 burglaries. The longest and most shocking trial of the 80s. Richard Ramirez was not only a murderer, but also a symbol of evil and darkness in society. He died in prison in 2013 after nearly 3 decades on death row. However, his crimes continue to be mentioned in documentaries, books, and TV shows as a reminder of the evil that humans can reach. Thank you for joining The Most Everything to explore the most interesting and wonderful things in the world. If you love this content, don't forget to support us, share with your friends, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything new. Click the bell icon to always be the first to receive unique stories from The Most Everything. See you in the next video.